Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started. I am Daniela Bleichmer. I am the director of the USC Levan Institute for the Humanities. And people are still coming in, but we're going to get going. We are here for one of our monthly book chats that celebrate recent publications by authors at USC. And I am delighted that we will be discussing this wonderful recent book by Henry Jenkins, Comics and Stuff. Joining us today are Daniel Miller, Professor of Anthropology at University College London, and Hillary Chute, Professor of English and Art and Design at Northeastern University. And the conversation today will be moderated by our colleague Tara McPherson from Cinema and Media Studies at USC. So please turn on your cameras if at all possible. We find that it is more convivial to see faces than still photographs or names. This is a very casual conversation. Tara will moderate the discussion between Henry and the respondents for about 20 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions from anyone. Please mute yourself unless you have been asked by the moderator to talk. And thank you so much for joining us, Tara.
Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here. It's especially exciting to be here to moderate a conversation with Henry, because Henry was my first boss. Many years ago, Henry brought me to MIT as a visiting assistant professor and was a wonderful mentor, as he's been to many, many scholars since that time. So I look forward to the conversation. Henry has a very wide-ranging career and has written about a broad number of topics, but I know that comics have always been near and dear to his heart. And if you've read the book, you now know that as well. So we'll start off with Henry doing just a kind of brief overview of the book, and then we'll have a conversation with our interlocutors. And then after about half an hour, open the conversation up to all of you. So be thinking about your questions about comics and about the conversation you are hearing. So Henry?
So this book, like all good research, began as a joke. I was asked what my next book would be about, and I said, comics and stuff. And that was the title that I decided to stick with through the entire project. But at the time, I had very little idea of what stuff would mean in relation to comics. And so I put stuff into a search engine, and up came Daniel Miller, who had written a book on stuff. And reading that book took me on a path into connecting with a variety of other scholars who've been talking about material culture, stuff, things across a variety of different disciplines. But as I dug into it, I saw anthropology, sociology, archaeology. I saw stuff on high literature and high art. But I saw relatively little work, oddly enough, about the culture that Raymond Williams tells us is ordinary, that is popular culture. And so I became determined to use that tool set to think about comics. And as I was undergoing that process, I took off my shelf a copy of Hillary's graphic Women and used that as my guidebook for what a book on graphic novels might look like. It's a book that I really admire and really learned a great deal about writing this book from Hillary's book. So I'm really excited to see both of them here today. It means a lot to me that you're willing to participate in this conversation. So what is comics and stuff ultimately about? Well, first of all, it's about a transformation of what comics mean within our culture. It recognizes this concept of graphic novels, takes that its own term, and says these are graphic novels more often than not about everyday life. And everyday life is full of objects. not mine at the moment. I'm renting an apartment to take care of my family, and there's nothing on the wall that speaks to me, and I dearly miss my stuff. But that sense of the graphic novel as a novel has led to a certain cultural status, has led to shifts in modes of publication, and transferred this kind of disposable form into an enduring form, something that we hold on to, something that's hardbound, something that's allowed into libraries, and so forth. So one part of the book is about comics as stuff, and what are we doing with comics? What are the material practices around comics? There's a great book with the title what to do with books in Victorian culture, for example, and it's about books as objects, as things that we engage with. But I found as these comic artists began looking at everyday life, they both narrate stuff, they trace the trajectory of objects and how they acquire meaning, whether that's through collecting or through kind of culling and sorting through things we inherit from previous generations. Those two operations are told often in comics, but they also display stuff. That is, they depict things in the material environment as part of the mise-en-scène. And of course, cinema, television does that as well. But in the case of comics, literally nothing is there unless it's drawn by the artist. And that work of drawing those objects, which are often modeled on things the artist actually has in the environment around them, that work of drawing them requires extra labor. So the more stuff you cram in your frame, the more labor it takes to produce that panel, the longer your workday becomes. And there's no economic incentive for that other than fan appreciation, right? In the short run, you make no more money if you have a very detailed page or if you have a page that's sparse. So what I chose were a series of artists that to me represented a range of different ways of telling the story of stuff and displaying stuff through their design, and try to identify the kind of mental model around that, right? There's another good book called Friends of Interpretable Objects, and which argues that objects acquire meaning through the communities of interpretation around them. And therefore, what we need to do when reading the stuff in comics is to reconstruct the interpretive community that's engaged with that. And so that might be monster fans. In the case of my favorite thing is monsters. It could be collectors of Victorian materials, as in Alice in Sunderland. Each chapter is about a different artist, their relationship to stuff, their visual practices, and the interpretive frames they put around that stuff. And that's the essence of what Comics and Stuff tries to do.
Am I unmuted now? Well, I could jump in and ask the first question unless, Daniel, you have something in mind right away. I just have to tell everybody that I first met Henry. I was just thinking of this when he very kindly mentioned my book at the San Diego Comic-Con when we were on a panel together in 2011 at Comic-Con, which is a really exciting place to meet a scholar whose work you have admired for years and years and years, is to be on a panel together at Comic-Con. And the panel was on transmedia, I remember. So it's just a real pleasure for me to get to be an interlocutor with Henry and with Daniel and others today. So one of my questions has to do with world making, which is a topic that comes up throughout the book, but I'm thinking specifically in the chapter on the cartoonist known as Seth and his comics and his cardboard city. So this is a cartoonist who built a cardboard city that is also depicted in his comics. And he has this great quote that you have in the book where he says, "I am just trying to make it the world that I want to live in." So I wanted to open by asking you, Henry, if you could talk a little bit about the process of world making in comics as distinct from in other media.
Well, I think Seth is very interesting in that regard because he is a very, very good comics artist and a good imitator of other comics artists. So there's wonderful pastiche running through his work. But I think he's also very interested in material practices, whether it's doll theater or puppet theater. It's sort of a blending of the two. He's done kind of conceptual work with rubber stamps. And he has this project of building Dominion, which is a city that runs through a number of his books, but in which he's gradually constructed from cardboard. And he began this process by just sketching art aspects of mid-century Canadian architecture that spoke to him and combining them, merging them to create an imaginary city on the page, and then building it out as something that you could actually visit and look at. It's still a scale model. But he also talks about his own environment as curated, as constructed, as an art project, and his persona as such. And I think particularly during COVID, many of us have been actively curating our environment, trapped inside, surrounded by the same four walls. We start to go crazy and change things around and construct a world we feel safe in. And I think that's very much the case with some of the houses that Daniel wrote about in The Comfort of Things, where he's describing a series of apartments along the same street in London, and the different ways people have chosen to construct them. And I would say that's world making as much as any fictional world making. It is just a way of creating order and meaning from the things that we encounter in the world around us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
I would love to hear Daniel talk a little bit more about frameworks for thinking about stuff and how they manifest for Henry's book, right? Because he draws on your work really richly, and I think it would be useful for the audience to hear about some of the ways you've grappled with stuff in your work and how you see that intersecting with Henry's project.
Certainly. I mean, to me, the triumph of this book, and I think it is a triumph, is actually the degree to which this is not a book about stuff. Okay, so that's not what you expected me to say. So let me explain, right? I come out of this material culture background where everybody was studying objects, stuff. And the problem was that the traditions of, say, museum studies and a lot of artwork was that it was only about the stuff in and of itself, right? Meticulous analysis, but that's where it ends. And what we were trying to do from the beginning was to say, actually, what matters, what's important to us is actually understanding what the stuff does as an expressive medium for people. That ultimately, it's always about people. The stuff is a conduit. It's what we use, yes, to decorate, to express, and do all these things. And we are thoroughly material in that sense. But our job was not just to fetishize, but to actually go beyond. And that's where this book is wonderful, because basically at no point does it really sort of get halted by, it's fascinated though it is with the stuff. It's always really trying to use that in order to understand both the creators, the graphic artists, but also what they in turn were trying to comment with respect to their family or all these other matters. And I think that is really my own sense of the continuity, because what we tried to do was this mission of de-fetishizing the object, that say, what we care about. And in a way that also kind of leads to my question, because I mean, almost as I was reading the book, I think, well, who do I credit with this? Because on the one hand, you get a portrayal of all these graphic artists whose point that partly was, that they are trying to show with great poignancy how they dealt with, say, their father's late possessions, or what is it about a collector that really leads them into this particular path. On the other hand, to be honest, I suspect that really the credit goes to the author. I mean, there is just such a humanity in this book. You just sense this is somebody who really cares about people. And in that sense, I think, that's the safe person to be writing about objects, because that's what they will always do. And I just thought, that's what I've always wanted out of material culture studies. And I think that's exactly what this book exemplifies. How do you use stuff to care about and actually understand people better? I'm not sure that was a question, but that was that's the answer to what you were asking.
maybe you could use that kind of as a jumping off point to think about that through line through so much of your work. I mean, I think one of the reasons your early work like Textual Poacher so resonated with readers was that humanity, right? The deep interest you've always had in connecting to the everyday and to people's enjoyment of the everyday.
Yeah, I mean, it comes out of Raymond Williams' idea that culture is ordinary. I'm like 2 academic generations removed from Williams, and that Williams educated John Fiske, who educated me. So I feel a kinship there, or a connection back to the origins of Birmingham cultural studies. And in some ways, this book is a return to roots, to thinking about meaning and how human beings make meaning out of media, out of culture, but extending my notion of media in this case to include the objects and depictions of objects. And what I connected with material cultural studies, and particularly Daniel's work, was this sense that this was a human activity of making meaning out of dealing with the material things around them. It was not about the agency of material things, even though that's part of the debate in material cultural studies at this time, but it was very much rooted in this idea that humans still make meaning of their lives through the things they choose to hold on to. And I think, as someone who I describe myself as somewhere between a pack rat and a hoarder, right? For me, that process of holding on to objects and making meaning of them was something I wanted to understand about myself. And so, just as being a fan was something I wanted to understand about myself when I wrote Textual Poachers, or my current book project is about childhood in the 50s and 60s, which I call my second childhood book, A, because I've written one already, and B, because I'm returning to things that mattered to me as a child late in my career and trying to make sense of them all over again. So all of my projects in one degree or another have a strong autobiographical element. I write about things that touch me, that are part of my immediate life world. And that I write about different kinds of things with different interpretive frames, but always with a sense of making sense of how meaning gets produced, circulated among a community of people. And each of these graphic artists spoke to me in some way because we had something in common, from being fellow collectors, even if I didn't collect exactly the same things they did, or being obsessed with mid-century architecture. I live in the Eastern Building, which is an Art Deco masterpiece here in downtown LA, or to something like growing up in monster culture in the 60s, or growing up, not very far from the artist Jeremy Love, who does Bayou. We grew up in the same place on the opposite side of a color line, and he is drawing on aspects of Southern mythology that I recognize as part of my culture, but we interpret them in somewhat different ways. So the sense of writing and dialogue with these authors about things we both cared about was very much part of the project that Comics and Stuff became.
And it seems like you have a kind of very nimble ability to connect the themes of the way the writers are kind of framing the stuff they engage with larger themes of history or gender, right? So I wonder if maybe Hillary could talk a little bit for us about the ways in which the book intersects with your work, and kind of pulling out those themes around kind of large cultural questions and the unique way that comics, graphic novels could really grapple with themes that are, very pressing in culture today.
Sure. So that's an interesting topic. So, one of the arguments in Henry's book that I really appreciate is related to one of the chapters he just mentioned about Emil Ferris's book, My Favorite Thing is Monsters. So, there is, and I'm speaking informally here, often a sense in comics culture that collectors are men, or it comes out of a certain kind of male culture, comics guys who like all this old stuff, who are maybe friends with each other, who are talking about issue X of, an old New Yorker, this type of thing, that it's very male. And one of the things that Henry does in this book that I appreciate so much is in his analysis of Emile Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters, he writes about a young, queer, female protagonist who does not have access to resources to be a collector. But he writes about her work of making as a certain kind of collecting, or her way of participating in a meaningful culture of stuff. So she might not be able to collect it, but she can reproduce it, whether it's, B or C, movie stills from the television, or it's monster magazines, or it's works of art from the Art Institute in Chicago. She recreates it, and that's part of the work of the book. So that to me is a really meaningful part of Henry's book, the way he shows us that you don't need to be a privileged person to participate in these certain cultures around collecting.
Yeah, I think part of the struggle for me of writing this book is I did not want it to be a mostly white male book about collecting. That got a little too close to autobiographical and didn't reflect my commitments to feminist scholarship and so forth. But initially, I had to think my way out of that frame that you're just talking about and figure out how to deal with some of these female artists. And the first that I really found that made sense in the new frame was C. Tyler, who you'll never know, and where I discovered this role of scrapbooking as a kind of female mode of collecting and something that spilled over into comics in a variety of ways. And I discovered that in part through reading your analysis of Fun Home and the way Alison Bechtel carefully copied artifacts from her own life into Fun Home. And then looking at C. Tyler's, whose world connected to me, her parents have the same generation of mine. I saw so much of my parents and her parents, and getting to sit down with her, we brought her for a Visions and Voices event here at USC, and we were able to sit down together and talk and get to know each other. And then when I got my hands on Emile Ferris's book, it was like I read it and then I reread it and then I reread it, and then I sat down to write almost without taking a breath, and wrote that chapter within a week of the first encounter with that book, because it spoke to me so profoundly and it so perfectly addressed a problem that I still saw in the book manuscript at that point, of trying to be more inclusive of women's voices in comics and figure out how that talk about gender without making overgeneralizations. And I was very uncomfortable with the simple split that I started with of women equal inheritance, men equal collecting, because I think there's some truth to that claim, but I think there's much more complexity to it if we broaden, recognize that women's collecting has often not been acknowledged as collecting, right? Scrapbooking is collecting, it just doesn't look like the modes of collecting we associate with men.
Yes,
I come in on this theme of inclusivity, because I do think it's actually central to the book, in the sense that when I first started the book, to be honest, there was an element that I didn't think I was going to like, because when I heard it was about comics, I thought that was great. I'm always fascinated by the ordinary. So comics sounded fine. But then as I started reading the book, I saw this is actually going, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Have I frozen?
No.
Damn.
We can hear you.
Are you with me?
We can hear.
Yes.
Yes.
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay. So when I started this book, as I was saying, I was worried because what the book says is it isn't going to be about comics, the general popular media. It was going to be about this sort of slightly meta level, a slightly more art focused kind of the graphic novel. And I'm an anti-art person. I just have to minimalism of art, and I see it as kind of essentially exacerbating class differences and actually pretty anything but inclusive. So I started with the prejudice against. What the book I think does really well is it says actually this is one of those instances where people did manage to move into a genre where on aesthetic and many other grounds we can have respect for this as a kind of, I think, art practice, but it actually doesn't go in the direction of the sort of arty art. And one of the reasons is precisely this, the profusion, the attention to this mass of stuff that continues to kind of ground it. And if it's not, even if it's not what you might call realist, it's certainly all sort of stuff you can recognize and you can relate to. And I think it's, there aren't that many genres out there that I think actually manage that trick. And I think what this book does is show not only that this particular genre does do it, but also why and how it does it, and how central this sort of emphasis on sort of, I said, a profusion of description actually accomplishes that task.
Wow, yeah, thanks. I'm flattered by your respect for what I tried to achieve here. It really means a lot to me. And yeah, I think I think that I'm allergic to art by and large myself. I'm teaching this course on arts and culture journalism this semester, where I'm bumping up against things like opera that I've avoided most of my life, and yet discovering in it those elements of pop culture that do speak to me. So as a cultural studies person, I do have a deep critique of cultural hierarchy. But the challenge would be if I wrote about superhero comics, which is what I'm often asked about by people who would like it to be more pop culture oriented. Those are corporate enterprises. There are objects in them, but they're objects that are inherited by artists. And it becomes very, very difficult to pinpoint exactly where the meaning making of the artist comes into play as we look at that. It would be a different book. There are a handful of independent superhero comics that you might look at. Concrete is one that I find really interesting, which talks about the environment and material culture, celebrity culture in interesting ways, and stuff there is interpretable. But the stuff that would be in a superhero comics are things, when you see the Batcave drawn in a Batman comic, it's always the same 5 or 6 things: a giant penny, a dinosaur, a handful of other things that we see in the background. There is no profusion of stuff there, and there is no real attention to stuff there. So to get to everyday life and stuff, one had to go to the graphic novels whose aspiration is to talk about the everyday. And that's just the nature of where comics are at this point. I love to see someone take up that challenge and do that definitive analysis using comics and stuff and your work to talk, and Hillary's work to talk about the giant penny and where it comes from. I think it would be interesting, but it would be a very different project than what I ended up setting out to do. But Hillary, I think we've cut you off when you were about to talk more about gender, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Not to take over your job, Tara.
Well, I have so many questions. I can't remember which one I was about to articulate. But one thing I would really love to hear you talk about more, especially since we're on the topic of what comics is as a certain kind of art form or a certain kind of culture, is one of the things I love about this book is something you mentioned in your prefatory remarks, which is that it focuses on comics and stuff. So how stuff is presented and thematized and displayed, to use your verb, in comics, but also it focuses on comics as stuff. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about comics itself as stuff. And any thoughts you might have about, the materiality of, say, the page of comics, in addition to the materiality that's being presented within the frame.
Well, I first wrote about that in a book by Sherry Turkle, where she asked me, where I wrote this piece about superheroes and the roles in comics and the roles they played after the death of my mother, that I bought these comics on the way to the hospice to keep myself occupied. And every one of them left me encountering an orphan. And there was just the sense of I can't face this right now. But it led me to thinking a lot about the materiality of comics. And there's one of my favorite passages I ever wrote there is about the set of comics that got left at our lake house, and generations of boys coming up there, flipping through them on rainy Sunday afternoons, started to tear them and rip them apart, and they yellow over time, and squirrels got in and grabbed pieces of paper to make their nest from. And, in the end, I still have these comics, right? They're in my study. And if I was home, I could whip them out and show them to you, because they're a valued part of my life, but they're no longer readable in any way, right? They simply fell apart. And I think of that as the nature of comics as a disposable medium versus these hardbound books, some of them costing $100 or more, reprinting some of that same material, right? Which are now beautiful objects, they're meant to endure, but that are, don't have that kind of greasy kid stuff feel to them that I really loved reading a comic as a kid. And so that's part of what set me down this path. And then one of my students, Lana Schwartz, asked me at one point, well, what about comics as stuff? And that phrase stuck in my mind and made me to write about it. I now have a chapter coming out elsewhere on Hicksville, which is a kind of comics lovers utopia in New Zealand. And it's all have variety of different libraries, archives, material practices around it depicted through this book. So that was me beginning to apply an interpretive frame for thinking even deeper about comics and stuff. And hopefully that'll come out in the next year or so. But I'm still very, very drawn to this idea of comics and stuff. Hence the fact the book ends with a description of packing up my books from this project to ship to storage to make room for other things, among them comics, and unpacking comics, including my father's copies of Pogo, which had been something that he'd bought in the 50s as an undergraduate that's still in my personal collection, even though the content is surpassed by the new Fantagraphics reprints of that same comic strip.
Well, I'm so happy to learn that you are writing another book about comics.
Well, this is just an article at this point, but comics will always be part of what I write from here, I think. There's a lot about comics in the book I'm doing now on children's culture, the post-world era, where I go into Harvey comics, for example, and some of the kind Casper and Baby Hugo, Huey, and some other kinds of figures from my childhood that play a central role there. And there's a chapter about Dennis the Menace there. So I'm obsessed with at this point, and will be continuing to do work in comic studies, even if the next book is not exclusively about comics.
I love the way you just kind of narrated a history of the comics at the lake house, and the way the book kind of pulls in that kind of sense of comics being able to allow you to access your own history. But I also love the way you treat history within comics, particularly in the chapter on Bayou, which brings into kind of play histories we're both really interested in. And there's a very different kind of object that that book is kind of foregrounding and accessing as they represent things like the Confederate statues. So I wonder if you could reflect, for folks who maybe haven't had a chance to read the book, a little bit about how you see comics doing historical work.
Yeah, I mean, I think comics are constantly narrating histories, both consciously and unconsciously, whether it's the pseudo-Victorian atmosphere of some of the Granville books that Brian Talbot did, which are full of steampunky objects and tributes to early 20th century comics, to Bayou, which is very much, as I read it, about these bad objects, things that represent the history of comics and its entanglement with race, right? That these, a lot of what he animates there are to me, experienced as artifacts of that time that are brought to life, and we're told a kind of Alice in Wonderland like story set in the Jim Crow South, where Brer Rabbit functions as a character, which he connects back to Song of the South, which had been, as a boy growing up in Georgia, a really important film for me, and a film that's increasingly difficult for me to watch at the same time. And it's an object I've been using in my own progression to work through these debates about things like Confederate monuments or so forth, because they were such a vital part of my childhood and yet are unspeakably horrible at the current time. And I come to recognize the histories that were suppressed. I think about when I was in school in first grade, I learned to draw the Georgia flag. And at that point, the Confederate flag was part of the Georgia flag. And I thought it had always been there. And only recently I discovered it was added in the mid 50s, just a couple of years before I was born, and that it was added specifically in response to desegregation moves. So rather than being able to read it as part of my history that goes back across generations in my family, I was forced to confront that it had been a racist symbol all that time, that I felt eternal, and was only a couple of years old at the point that I was learning to engage with it. And so part of what I wanted to do in that chapter was struggle a bit on the page as a white Southerner raised in a segregated society during the civil rights era, to struggle a bit with what do these things mean to me? What do they mean to this Black artist author? How are those histories entangled with each other? How is comics implicated in that by the fact that comics both drew its own racist stereotypes, as Rebecca Wanzo has reminded us in a really powerful book that came out last year, but also that these same artists were doing ads and designing material things that reproduce those things as things that stayed around, that people held on to. And there's a really incredible moment in Special Exits, where the artist finds an old cake statue that had belonged to someone in her family's history, and she stumbles upon it in an old chest and has to decide what to do with it. Now, after the book was written and came out, I learned that her daughter-in-law accidentally dropped the object and shattered it. We know how accidental, she refused to say, but there was a sense that that object no longer exists except on her page. And the implications of it being reproduced now only by her is something that that artist is struggling with and thinking about the work that she produced. So I think as we think about Confederate monuments, to me, the problem has been that we're negating the monuments, but we're not reimagining what monuments' function could be to represent a different South, the South you and I know very well, a multicultural South that's still in the process of becoming. And rather than changing the names of all the streets in Atlanta from Confederate generals to Black civil rights leaders, we need to do something that's actually inclusive and multiplies, diversifies what we pay tribute to through monuments. And I think that's something we still need to think through on the ground if we're going to heal and not just negate the feelings that are attached to that.
Yeah, I know we have talked about these things before, and I would be happy to see most of the general names just gone. But at that point of not, kind of having resolution, maybe it's a good juncture to open the questions up to the audience as well. And if you want to type questions into the chat, that's a good option. Or if you want to, I think people may be able to unmute themselves, but they might have to be unmuted by the host, which I had to be at the very beginning. Maybe as we wait for audience questions, we can see if Hillary or Daniel have any last thoughts they want to kind of bring to the table.
It's a downbeat thought, but I mean, I'm just listening to this discussion of history, and I just wondered whether it's never in the book or in our discussion, but whether we don't have an element of lament here, in the sense that we're at a point where things are becoming digital. And actually, these bookcases where we express so much with the tangible object, the physicality of these things is kind of disappearing as we speak. And we can see a future in which basically they are not, things are going to be composed and read, but they are not going to have that presence. And maybe that's, one of the things that drives our conversation here, whether we like it or not, is a kind of sadness, because this meant so much to us, means so much to you, and yet we seem to be at the cusp of its disappearance. Is that, does that ring true at all? Or
no, I think you're making a bunch of connections that I chose to make implicit, but I think are very much running through it. And most of these artists, in one way or another, are looking to a past that's fragile, that's deteriorating, that they're having to let go of in one way or another. And each in their own way articulate what that sense of lament. And I think comics are experiencing that too, that the material comics today exist in a world where alongside digital comics. So rather than print being an inevitability, it's a choice. And as they make that choice, they're making a stand in a way for the importance of print as material objects that are worth holding on to, against another generation of comics artists that I don't talk about much in the book, the web artists, for whom the digital is the thing, but to make money, they still have to design it so it can be printed in books and sold, because there's no revenue from the web yet. And so the web, that economic incentive, creates constraints on how they can design their pages that the web had promised at one point to free comics artists from altogether. And I think that's the backstory that I'm not able to get to in the book, but it exists alongside these artists who are doing incredible things with printing comics and what a printed comics might be.
So we're getting some questions piling up. So I want to move to the audience. I'm going to start with a couple of folks who have raised their virtual hands, and then we'll also try to kind of circle back to some questions that are emerging in the chat. So Melanie Calvert.
Hey, how are you? I apologize for the background noise. I'm in New York City. But Henry, I'm from South Carolina, so I speak with a Southern accent originally. I've been in New York for 40 years, and I can definitely relate to so many things that you're saying. I was thinking about Mouse, the Spiegelman graphic novel, and I'm looking at the appetite of the current teenagers. What do you think? Because you know, we keep talking about maybe we've lost a lot in this pandemic, but potentially it might be a new way to reach out and engage students in conversation through the graphic novel.
Well, I think educators and librarians have very much been seeing that. I mean, if you go to a high school library today, you're going to see lots and lots of graphic novels. Scholastic has become one of the most important publishers of graphic novels after DC and Marvel. And there's wonderful work being done for younger readers. There used to be the story that comics were just aiming at older collectors and was going to die out. But now I think some of my favorite comics in recent years have been for younger readers and are things that absolutely can introduce the joy of reading to children and youth and can introduce them to history. I mean, I think about something like John Lewis's March, which is a 3-part memoir of coming of age as a civil rights leader that's very much designed to be read in the high school classroom or read by high school students to keep them aware of the struggles, which are all the more urgent for us to pay attention to as we speak, given I'm currently in the state of Stacey Abrams and watching this horrible voter suppression laws sweep across the country. I think that those graphic novels, or George Takei has a powerful graphic novel about his experiences in the Japanese internment camps during World War II. So there's a whole bunch of books that speak to that generation. And Renee Tellemeier is going to eternally dominate the New York Times bestseller list with these wonderful stories about girls and the awkwardness of adolescence and so forth that I think really speak in important ways to the generation that's coming up right now.
Great. Let's go to David Craig.
Thanks, Tara. Hi, Henry. As you know, I'm in the comic fandom set, but I wanted to just make a quick comment that's emerged out of my work around materiality and meaning making, which is that in my work around creators and influencers, the best-selling books on the New York Times best-selling list for the last 4 years now have been written by these 22-year-olds. Sometimes they're memoirs, if you can imagine. I can't imagine how they got a book out of those. Because the communities that have been making meaning through their engagement with these creators have this unquenchable desire to have a physical piece of a text on their shelf. It's as much as wearing a university logo or swag, and it becomes vital. It's a way to signal to other members of the community that we are members of the super fandom and we're members of the club. It's something I've studied. I still can't fully get my head around myself. But the question I wanted to ask for you was around the kind of somewhat around Dick Hebdige and around questions of the way in which comics and stuff have occupied subcultural knowledge and resistance, and the way in which we've seen these two trajectories almost converge around the explosion of comic interest at the pop culture level. I mean, it's literally one of the drivers of Disney Plus. And a plug, by the way, for your documentary. I'm calling it your documentary now, Henry. But then, of course, now an embrace of how comics and stuff can now occupy meaning making for subcultures who have not had that level of representation at such a, even though these are corporate driven in IP, they're now starting to, we're now seeing them embrace new subcultures who've been making meaning from these texts without ever actually seeing themselves in them. So I wondered if you might speak to that trajectory.
Yeah, there's a lot unpack in that, including this idea of that books are ways of displaying connection for people. I know the first thing I do when I visit an apartment of a friend is read their bookcase. I still try to do that with a magnifying glass on Zoom sometimes when we see books behind people, because it's so incredibly interesting. Years ago, I heard it was a talk by a guy at the MIT Media Lab who was talking about this device, which I think eventually became the Kindle. But he was presenting it as, this device, you will only have to own one device. You won't have to have your apartment cluttered with books anymore. And I looked at him, I stood up after him as a respondent role, and I said, that right now the average American only owns 2 books. So really you're only talking about a 50% reduction. But the idea that that books were the problem to be solved by these digital people, rather than as part of expression and human expressive activity, goes to the heart of what this debate about stuff might look like. And yes, to see yourself in the pages of a book is a very powerful thing when you haven't felt seen before. One of my a book that I loved years ago was Ariel Shrugg's Potential, which was the autobiographical comic of a teenage lesbian girl as she's coming out. And it's not especially well drawn book. It's okay, but the sense of the immediacy of the page, of the artist hand, which is something Hillary writes about in her work, spoke so powerfully to what it was to be a teenager, a queer teenager in a society not yet ready to accept who you are. And I think that book illustrates the point you're making. And it's not in a simple way that Hebdige might talk about appropriation and resignification. We see some of that in comics and stuff, but it's also the sense that this expresses who I am. I don't have to appropriate it. I can map my identity and meaning onto it because it's saying something about me that I recognize and see as valuable. And that's the kind of connection I felt with most of these artists. It wasn't to me about resistance at that point. It was about recognition.
I want to take us to a couple of questions that have emerged that are a little related, a question and a comment from the chat space. One which takes us back to the questions of monuments and asks to think about how monuments, I think in response to your kind of closing remarks before we opened up for questions, Henry, how monuments might help us sort of also address the mistakes of the past. And someone else pointing out the kind of translation, the adaptation of Butler's Kindred to the graphic novel form, right? Which I think does do some of that work to kind of help us rethink the past by imagining collectivity in different ways, right? So maybe you could reflect a little bit on that kind of rethinking of the mistakes of the past, also through the really powerful work you do with the Civic Media Project. And then Charlotte, I know your hand's up, so we'll come to you next.
Yeah, so I would start by saying, yes, to me, one of the most exciting images I've seen coming out of the protests last summer were some of the Confederate monuments covered with paint and graffiti, which was writing over the past while leaving it there to still be seen and recognized. Or I would love to see that then move to a graveyard of old monuments, such as we have the former Soviet Republic outside of Moscow, where all the toppled statues of communism are there for people to visit and reflect upon rather than made invisible. And so I think those monuments should continue to be monuments, but whether they need to occupy the public space and threaten people and seem to be for processes of intimidation, or whether they're places where we go to reflect upon the past that's an interesting question. And I sort of lean to the latter. I don't lament them being torn down, but I want us to remember that history, because the battle that I've seen in my lifetime has been hard fought and continues to be fought. And it's not like racism disappears because we get rid of Robert E. Lee, right? And so we've got to actually confront that. I think Octavia Butler's work, especially as expressed by Damian Duffy and John Jennings, is a powerful example of that. I mean, she really does ask us to reflect in that book on what the past was, how we can't fully escape it, how we're still implicated in the past. This is the story of a Black woman who gets pulled back through time to a pre-Civil War Maryland, where she's treated as a slave and struggle, and her husband eventually gets pulled back and begins to feel the mentality of a master. And that's the part that, as a white Southerner, chills me to my bone, is the degree to how easily he can slide back into that role, having married this Black woman, intelligent, powerful Black woman, having this intimate relation with her. And yet when they're thrown back into the past, they take on the ideologies of the past so fluidly and so easily. And that I think the consequences of that are very real. And I think seeing this team of artists and writers create that story in a visual form makes it accessible to even more people. That story's actually now been announced as going to be a television series as well. So I think it's kind of story we should be paying attention to. And in particular, Butler's hyper empathy, her sense of being open to the experiences of a number of different kinds of people in her community, her exploration of disability, her exploration of race, of how you bring communities together across her work, makes her probably the most important writer in my eyes for the last couple of years.
And really, I think that attention she brings to the planet and the environment as well. I mean,
yes.
I mean, I know the Renaissance and attention to Butler has a lot to do with her papers having been opened up at the Huntington, so the stuff of her archive is available. But I, just felt such immense delight having written about her work for so long, to see her name planted symbolically on Mars as the landing there, kind of named the landing for Octavia Butler. So, to the past and to the future.
Yeah, when she spoke at MIT years ago, she talked about seeing this horrible science fiction film, Devil Woman of Mars, which encouraged her to write because she felt like this was so bad that she had to do better. And so I think it's really fascinating that we get from Devil Woman on Mars to Octavia Butler being a permanent part of the Martian landscape.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Charlotte, thanks for your patience.
No, it's okay. You'll have to excuse the very fitting Black Panther in the background. Before I knew this was happening, I agreed to host a movie night for some of the students at uni. So my question is so right at the beginning, Henry, you talked about like the meaning making out that comes out of having these objects and having stuff around you, and it's not about the agency of media things. So right now I'm currently looking at parasocial relationships and transmedia storytelling, and I've been conducting a couple of interviews. One of the things which is coming out of that is people are seeing stuff and they're getting attached to that before engaging with perhaps transmedia text, and it's the stuff, these cultural icons almost, which are becoming the motivating factor. I was just wondering if you explored that at all in your book.
Not in the book, but it's a question that interests me a lot, is how do we I mean, I think of the pieces, the chapters in the book, the Alice in Sunderland chapter is most interested in how stories become stuff and how stuff symbolizes our attachment to particular narratives. But I think it is the transmedia extension of into material objects is really an important part of how transmedia works. In my vocabulary, I use this term extension as if to talk about souvenirs from fictional worlds that we carry out with us, that we hold on to remind us of the space we imagined, and that allow us to connect with other people through these objects. And I think what we're seeing as we move to the world of smart objects is people are putting pieces of stories, embedding them in objects so that there are different kinds of encounters with those objects than would have been possible in a purely material world. But they're doing the same things as these jugs that Brian Talbot talks about, the commemorated local heroes did in Sunderland, 100, 150 years ago. That it was always been objects that represent stories. Whether we called them transmedia or something else, they were part of how we related to an environment. And I often think about the Bible as experienced by the peasant class, the non-literate class in the Middle Ages, as something that was everywhere, but not anchored in a text, that was anchored in physical artifacts, whether they're stained glass windows or creches or whatever, that those anchored those stories, which they did not have a text that they could draw on because they were not reading, to hold on to those stories in any other way. And it's like a physical memory palace. So we can see Notre Dame as a total transmedia environment where every representational tool available in that time was translating into sound and material objects, the biblical stories.
I love that when Charlotte asked her question, everyone could see build a dissertation in the background of her image, right? And it so powerfully takes us back to the things you were saying at the beginning, Henry, about the role of objects in this virtual life we're leading right now. And that echoes with a question from Paulina Lance in the chat to ask you just to reflect a little more on that, on how this kind of contemporary moment where so much of our lives are being lived through screen space does make us aware of our stuff, right? My stuff's kind of driving me crazy since I can't get away from it right now. And, even more so, my husband's stuff is driving me crazy, which includes many boxes of collected comic books in the garage that is also the space for my office. So, maybe to close this out, you could reflect a little bit on those tensions between the digital and the physical and, our stuff.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that Zoom makes our stuff visible, and we either choose to put it on display as these artists do, or we paper over it with backdrops of one sort or another, many of which, if I look at my students, represent fictional worlds, images from comics, images from anime or films, which invite us to think about the role of mise-en-scène and those things instead, right? So this is an era of mise-en-scène because Zoom forces us to look at it in that way. And so, yeah, curating our environment for the Zoom camera is one of the things that we do, almost as much as staring at our own face and going, my beard needs a trim, and this kind of, to be forced to look into the mirror all day long. In some ways, our stuff is just a different kind of mirror by which we represent ourselves to the world. And mine, just like my beard, is a little shabby much of the time, but the absence of it makes the heart grow fonder. And so while I was in my own apartment, I was climbing the walls with all kinds of projects I wanted to work on as soon as my wife and I got back together again from her being away. And now I stare at it and I go, where is all of my stuff? How can I express my identity in the absence of the things that make meaning out of my life? And so I think both are problems for us at the moment. If you're away from home and have only the things you can fit in a suitcase, as many of our students are, or they may be home, but all of their stuff is back in their dorm room, then I think that sense of absence of stuff heightens our awareness of why stuff is meaningful in our lives.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I think this has been a really far-ranging and lively conversation that might make your relationship to your stuff feel a little bit different in the time ahead. I want to thank Daniel and Hillary for their provocative questions, but also for their work, which intersects so well with the themes of Henry's book. And everybody at Levin, thank you for these book chats. I think it's really important to feature the work of the scholars at USC in these kind of informal conversations with, people far and near now that we're virtual. So thank you. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to kind of have this opportunity. So. Daniela, do you want to close us out?
Thank you.
Oh, last words? No, thank you all. Henry, Daniel, Hillary, this was fantastically interesting. Where's my copy of the book? If you haven't read it, get your copy now. There we go. Okay, we can all wave our stuff. Thank you all for joining us. Congratulations, Henry. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks, Daniel and Hillary, for joining me for this.
Pleasure.
Such a pleasure.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Henry. Always nice to talk to you.
Likewise. Likewise. And Daniel, we're going to have many more conversations.
Oh, yes, I would love to. I look forward to it. So thanks again.